How you doing, guys? Today we're going to show you the difference between a two-stage and a single-stage AR-15 style trigger. This right here is a pretty much standard Milspec trigger. This piece right here is the trigger, and the sear interface on this is right here. This front face interfaces with the hammer, as you can see right here, right on this little tiny metal shelf. So what happens is you push the trigger rearward, this piece right here comes down, so it's coming down and out of the way and allows the hammer to come forward. I'll show you real quick here. We'll hold this like this. As I pull this down, you see this little shelf right here comes down, out of the way, it allows the hammer to come forward. What happens when the rifle cycles, as you hold the trigger down, everything happens real quick. The hammer comes back and catches on the disconnector, which is this guy right here. So this guy right here hooks this hook on the hammer with the disconnector, which is spring loaded, and holds the hammer down while the trigger is being held down to let the rifle cycle back and forth. The rifle comes back to rest. As you let off the trigger, the disconnector unhooks and the sear re-engages. So this face is not interfaced at the moment. This one is. As I let go of the trigger, this will unhook and recatch on this face. See how that happens? So sear interface, disconnector interface is right here. It's one stage. So the trigger has to, when you push on this forward, there is positive engagement between this face and that face. As you pull the trigger, you actually have to pull the hammer back just a touch. I don't know if we can see it here. You see how I pull, as I pull on that hammer, that I pull on the trigger, the hammer wants to come down just ever so slightly. That right there is part of the positive engagement. And the amount of force required to pull this back and pull this down, and the friction here, is going to determine the trigger weight pull. That is a basic Milspec single stage style trigger. Alright guys, this right here is a Geissele Super Dynamic two-stage trigger. You see there are now two hooks on this trigger, and this rear hook on the hammer looks a little different. The way this trigger works is this face right here no longer does any interface. It just does not hold the trigger. It's just kind of it's there from the original design, but it's not part of the hammer sear interface. Where the hammer sear interface is now is right here. This is the new hammer sear interface. The way this trigger works is you pull the trigger, this wants to come away from this, so this moves forward as the trigger moves backwards, and there is an initial stage when you take, I would say, about 70% of the engagement out of the way. What ends up happening is this first stage is about 2 pounds to go from here to there. What happens is the disconnector back here now pushes on this rear knuckle, or this disconnector interface. So what happens is you pull the trigger, you got 0 to 2 pounds, and then you have to compress this spring that's right here that keeps the disconnector hook forward. So as you pull the trigger, you hit the disconnector spring, and then you then have to compress the disconnector spring to fully disengage this sear engagement. And then as the hammer comes back, basically everything else kind of works the same. So as you're holding the trigger down, the disconnector catches. As you release, this hook on the other side re-engages the trigger. So the trigger is now re-engaged, it's reset. This right here, again, as I pull the trigger, we'll show this one more time. The hammer comes forward. I then have to push this back and down. I have to push this back and down out of the way. So 0, 2.5 pounds. To push that spring down is about 4.5 pounds on this particular trigger. See, I don't know if you could see that getting compressed, but this then compresses to let the hammer come forward. That's a two-stage trigger. A lot of guys use these what they call a kind of a combat trigger.